The room has not changed in 43 years. It sits at the far end of the Carver family home, tucked behind a door that creaks like an old throat clearing itself before speaking. Sunlight still spills through the east-facing window. In the mornings, crawling across the faded carpet in slow golden strides, the air inside carries a smell that is part dust, part something softer, a memory of fresh paint that should have vanished decades ago, but never did. In the center of the room stands the wall, or rather the half of a wall. Its upper half is washed in a muted silver gray, a color the paint store once called morning fog. The lower half remains the dull beige of the original drywall. As if caught mid-transformation, the dividing line between the two is not neat. A single curved brushstroke arcs across that line, frozen where it began to dip downward, its bristles never having completed the stroke. On the floor beneath it lies the brush, not tossed, not dropped in panic, but as if someone had simply let go. The wooden handle is worn smooth, and the metal ferrule is dulled from time. The bristles, stiff, now still cling to that silvery gray, each strand holding the color as though afraid to forget it. The paint tray to the left still holds its contents, though time has turned the once fluid pigment into a hardened ripple, like a pond frozen mid-wave. You can see where the brush had pressed into it, scooping up what would become the last stroke. Police photographs captured all of this back in 1982. They are still kept in the county archive, grainy prints with their corners curled, the kind of images that bleed with the warm yellow of old film in them. The brush, the tray, the unfinished wall, all are framed like clues, but the strangeness isn't in what is there, it's in what isn't. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no scuff marks across the carpet, no signs of a struggle, no hurried footprints in the paint, not even a smudge where someone might have touched the wet wall in haste. The room looks as if its occupant stepped away for a single moment and simply never came back. Neighbors remember the day in fragments. Mrs. Heller from across the street swears she saw a young girl standing at the window, hair pulled back, a streak of paint on her cheek. She says the girl looked at her, really looked, with an expression that was neither happy nor frightened, but something else entirely, something unreadable. Then the moment was gone. By the time Mrs. Heller glanced back, the window was empty. Others remember nothing at all. The official case file calls it a suspicious disappearance, but among the locals, it's something different. They call it the still room, a name whispered like a superstition. Parents told their children not to walk past the Carver house alone after dark. Teenagers dared each other to peek through the glass. Some swore they could hear the faint sound of a radio playing from inside, a tune from the early 80s, faint and scratchy, as if carried by a signal from another time. And then there's the strangest detail of all, the one even the most skeptical can't quite dismiss. Over the years, the rest of the house aged in the ordinary way, paint fading, wallpaper peeling, wood warping with the seasons. But inside that room, the morning fog never dulled. The line between painted and unpainted wall never bled or cracked, and that single last brushstroke somehow impossibly still looks damp when the light catches it just right. A forensic technician years later would explain it away. He said that layers of dust, oils, and the unique conditions of the room's humidity had preserved the sheen. He said it was nothing more than chemistry and coincidence, but even he admitted in a voice low enough to suggest he regretted it that the first time he stepped inside, the hair on his arms had lifted and his heart had begun to pound for no reason he could name. There is a moment when you stand in the center of that room where the silence feels heavy, not the comfortable quiet of an empty space, but the thick, suspended quiet of a held breath. It feels as though the air is waiting for what no one knows. The Carver family has never repainted. The door is kept shut most of the time, but not locked. It's her room. Mrs. Carver once told a local reporter, "If she comes back, I want it to be exactly the way she left it." But deep down in the way she looked past the camera when she said it, you could tell she wasn't sure if she meant Ellie or something else entirely. And so the room remains, the wall remains, the brush remains, waiting. Before she became the subject of police reports and whispered legends, Eleanor Carver was simply Ellie, 17 years old, barefoot, more often than not the kind of girl who made you feel like the summer air was warmer when she walked into a room. Ellie had a smile that wasn't polished for photographs. It was crooked, alive, the kind that would bloom mid-sentence and catch you off guard. She lived in a small corner of Illinois where the streets folded in on themselves, and everyone's mailbox was a shade of white, gone soft from too many winters. Her world was measured in the walk from home to the local library, the taste of soda from the drugstore fountain, the dusty clink of coins in her father's old jar for ice cream money. She was an artist in the way only a 17-year-old can be endlessly certain that every color meant something. If she painted a wall gray, it wasn't because it was fashionable, it was because morning fog looked exactly like the air in early August before the sun burned the mist. Away her bedroom was a small square sanctuary. On one wall hung a corkboard filled with clippings and ocean at sunset, a woman's hands braiding her hair, an old typewriter, missing 2 keys. None of them belonged to the same world, but they belonged to her. Above her bed, pressed into the wood of the headboard, were tiny grooves, the marks she had carved with a nail one summer when Shed decided to count the days until she graduated. Ellie's family was a quiet one. Her father, Richard, worked as a mechanic at the same garage for over 20 years. Her mother, Margaret, kept the house, baked bread on Sundays, and had a way of folding laundry that made even old t-shirts feel crisp. Her younger brother, Daniel, was 11, a wiry, restless shadow who followed Ellie around the yard, convinced she knew everything worth knowing. If you asked her friends, they'd tell you Ellie was the kind of girl who'd slip you a note in class with a hand-drawn comic on it, or show up at your window at night with a flashlight and a pack of gum just to talk. She wasn't loud, but she had a magnetism, a quiet confidence that made people want to orbit her. That summer of 1982, Ellie's life was suspended between childhood and whatever came next. She had been accepted into a small art program in Chicago for the fall. A fact she shared with almost no one, not because she wasn't proud, but because it felt like a fragile secret, something that might dissolve if too many people touched it. She spent her days sketching in the backyard, her knees folded under her hair pulled back with a ribbon Shed borrowed from her mother's sewing box. Sometimes Shed paint at the kitchen table, the smell of turpentine mixing with the cinnamon of her mother's bread cooling on the counter. Friends say she had a strange energy that summer. She was still herself, still laughing, still doodling in the margins of notebooks. But there were moments when Shed go quiet, as if her mind had stepped out of the room. Shed stare into the middle distance, brush motionless in her hand until someone spoke her name. Her choice to repaint her bedroom was sudden. One morning, she dragged an old sheet across the carpet, moved her furniture against the opposite wall, and told her mother she'd be finished by evening. When Margaret asked why the sudden change, Ellie just shrugged and said it needs to feel lighter. No one thought much of it. Teenagers rearranged their worlds all the time. Margaret bought her the paint she wanted, morning fog 2 gallons, along with a new angled brush Ellie had picked out herself. She also bought Ellie a small tin of lemon cookies from the bakery because she knew her daughter liked to snack while she worked. Neighbors recall seeing her in the driveway that morning, hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, flecks of primer on her jeans. She waved to them, smiling. One neighbor remembers her whistling as she carried the paint inside. It was an ordinary morning, the kind you never think will matter until it's all you have left. In the days after she vanished, reporters asked her friends what they remembered most about Ellie. The answers were always small things: the way Shed tap her pencil against her teeth when she was thinking, how Shed draw tiny birds in the corners of her notes, how she never seemed to be in a hurry unless it was to catch the ice cream truck. Her best friend Laura once said it's like she was always halfway somewhere else, not in a sad way, more like she knew something was waiting for her and she was just getting ready to meet it. Whether that something was the future she dreamed of or the fate she couldn't see coming, no one would ever know, because by the time the day was over, Ellie Carver, the girl who could make a room brighter just by walking into it, was gone. August 14th, 1982, the kind of summer day that hummed. The air was heavy, but not suffocating, warm enough to loosen your shoulders, slow enough to make the cicadas sound like they were dragging each note out as far as it could go. A faint breeze rolled in from the east, carrying the smell of cut grass and distant charcoal smoke from someone's backyard grill. Ellie woke early that morning, earlier than anyone else in the house. Margaret would later recall the sound of running water just after sunrise, the faint squeak of the bathroom faucet, and the low thump of Ellie's bedroom door closing again. She ate a light breakfast, a single slice of toast with honey, half a peach. The rest of the peach she left on the counter, as if Shed meant to come back to it. By 9:15 a.m., she had cleared her room bed, pushed to the far wall, dresser angled toward the corner, corkboard taken down, and leaned against the hallway wall. She laid the old bedsheet over the carpet like a stage curtain, settling into place. The morning fog paint can sat in the middle of the room, lid pried open, its pale silver-gray surface catching the light in a soft shimmer. She dipped the new angled brush in and drew her first stroke along the top corner, the bristles whispering against the wall. Outside, a neighbor's lawn mower started up, the sound pushing in through her open window. then fading when she moved to the opposite wall. The radio on her dresser played softly a Chicago station spinning pop songs and static-laced news updates. One of the songs was Eye in the Sky by the Alan Parsons Project. A friend would later swear that was the last thing Ellie ever heard. Around 10:30 a.m., her brother Daniel knocked on her door asking if she wanted to go ride bikes with him to the park. She laughed and told him maybe later. In the middle of something, her voice was cheerful. Distracted, Daniel left, and the door clicked shut behind him. Margaret checked in on her around 11:15 a.m. Ellie was on her knees cutting in the edges along the baseboard with careful, steady strokes. A streak of paint curled along her wrist where she had brushed a hair out of her face. Without noticing, Margaret told her she was going to the grocery store. Ellie nodded without looking up, saying only it'll be done before dinner by 12:30 p.m. The room was half finished. The upper sections of two walls glowed with the silvery tone of morning fog, while the other two still wore their dull beige. The paint tray was flecked with ripples where the brush had moved through it a little. More than half empty. At 1:05 p.m., Mrs. Heller, the neighbor across the street, swears she saw Ellie through the window. Ellie stood in the frame, holding the brush loosely, hair falling over one shoulder. She wasn't painting, she was just staring straight ahead. Mrs. Heller lifted her hand in a small wave. Ellie didn't wave back, but her lips moved, as if forming a word too quiet to carry across the street. Then she stepped back from the window. That is the last confirmed sighting of her alive. At 1:30 p.m., the grocery store receipt shows Margaret buying bread, eggs, milk, and a jar of strawberry jam. Richard was still at work at the garage. Daniel was at the park with friends. At 2:05 p.m., a neighbor 2 houses down reported hearing a noise, not a scream, not a crash, just something like furniture being dragged. He assumed someone was rearranging a room and thought nothing of it. By 2:20 p.m., the house was silent again. At 3:10 p.m., Margaret returned home. She carried the groceries into the kitchen, set them down, and called for Ellie. No answer. She went to the bottom of the stairs and called again. Still nothing. She walked down the hallway toward Ellie's room, the smell of fresh paint growing stronger. The door was open. The first thing she noticed was the brush lying on the floor, bristles down the handle, angled toward the wall. The paint tray sat next to it, the surface still glistening. The second thing she noticed was the silence, not the absence of music. The radio had been turned off, not the absence of voices that was normal. This was deeper, a silence that made her ears feel like they were holding their breath. She stepped inside. The room felt wrong. The air was cooler than the hallway. The sunlight through the window was sharp, almost too bright, as if the glass had been polished in her absence. Half the wall was finished, half wasn't. That last brushstroke curved downward and stopped, as if frozen in motion. Ellie, she called again, softer this time. No answer. She checked the bathroom, the backyard, Daniel's room. Nothing. By the time Richard arrived home at 5:30 p.m., panic had set in. They searched the house top to bottom. They checked the shed, the attic, the crawlspace. Neighbors joined in calling her name across the yards. When the police arrived at 6:15 p.m., the paint on the wall was still tacky to the touch. It was as if she had been painting one moment and gone the next. When people vanish, they usually leave something behind: a broken lock, a trail of footprints, a witness who saw them turn a corner. Ellie Carver left only a half-painted wall. The first responding officer was Patrolman James Rowe, a man who had lived in the same county his whole life and thought had seen everything that could happen in a quiet Illinois town. He stepped into Ellie's room at 6:24 p.m., squinting against the late afternoon light that poured in through the open window. His first words were to no one in particular. "Where's the mess?" It was instinct. Disappearances are messy: chairs overturned, drawers open, papers scattered like the remnants of a storm. But here nothing. The bed was pushed against the far wall in neat alignment. The dresser stood at its new angle. The sheet on the floor lay smooth, except for the circle of space where the paint sat. The brush resting on the wood floor looked more like someone had set it down in thought than dropped it. In fear, Rowe ran his hand over the painted section of wall. It was smooth, slightly cool, and sticky enough that when he pulled his hand away, the faint scent of morning fog trailed up toward him. In the police report, he noted paint fresh, work in progress, no sign of struggle, no visible forced entry. Margaret and Richard explained that Ellie had been in this room only hours earlier. There was no sign she had taken anything. Her purse was still on her bed, her shoes by the door, even the peach pit from her breakfast remained in the kitchen trash. One by one, the officers checked the rest of the house: basement clear, garage clear, attic clear, even the crawlspace cramped and stifling turned up nothing but cobwebs and dust. At 7:03 p.m., the search extended to the yard and the neighboring streets neighbors reported seeing her earlier in the day, painting standing at the window waving to a friend from the sidewalk. But no one had seen her leave. The timeline was brutally tight. Whatever had happened had happened between 1:05 p.m. when Mrs. Heller saw her at the window and roughly 2:20 p.m. when the house fell unnaturally silent. What baffled investigators most was the absence of physical clues. Ellie's room was a closed loop. The window was open, yes, but the flower bed beneath it showed no signs of disturbance, no crushed plants, no displaced soil, no shoe prints. The screen had not been removed. The door to the hallway opened and closed cleanly, its hinges well-oiled, no splintered wood around the frame if someone had entered or exited through it. They did so without force. Detective Paul Hensley, who would lead the case, stood in the doorway for several minutes before stepping inside. Years later, in an interview, he would admit something that never made it into the official file. It didn't feel like she left. It felt like she just stopped existing. By 9:00 p.m., the search was widened to the nearby woods and the shallow river bend 2 miles away. Volunteers moved in lines calling her name, flashing their beams into the underbrush. Police dogs were brought in from the next county. The dogs entered the Carver home, sniffed at her pillow, and were led toward the room. And there, for reasons no one could fully explain, the dogs balked. They whined, circled the doorway, and one even sat down, refusing to enter. The handlers urged them forward, but the animals strained at their leashes as if they were being pulled back. One dog took a single step inside and froze, staring at the half-painted wall before backing out. Again, there was no physical barrier, no strange smell that humans could detect, but the dogs would not go further. Theories began forming almost immediately. The simplest, that she had walked out of the house voluntarily, seemed to crumble under the weight of details. Where would she go? Without shoes, why leave mid-task, mid-stroke? Without telling anyone, why leave her purse, her ID, her life? More sinister theories followed. Abduction, a stranger entering while she painted, but there was no sign of entry, no trace left behind. The floorboards bore no extra weight, no muddy shoe prints, no scuffs, no displacement of the bedsheet protecting the carpet. Then there was the sound reported by the neighbor 2 houses down, furniture dragging. Investigators returned to Ellie's room, examining every inch, but the furniture was exactly as Margaret described earlier in the day. No marks on the floor, no sign anything had been moved after 11 a.m. The only movement was that unfinished curve on the wall, a brushstroke that trailed off into nothing. Local rumor began within 48 hours. Some claimed the paint color was cursed. Others whispered about an old disappearance in the same house. A tenant from the 1950s had never been found. The Carvers had never heard that story, and county records showed no such case. But the human mind is quick to fill silence with shadows. In the days that followed, the house became something of a spectacle. Strangers slowed their cars to stare at the window. Teenagers dared each other to knock on the door. Reporters tried to push their way inside, hungry for photographs of the room where a girl vanished into thin air. Detective Hensley did not believe in the supernatural, but standing in that room, in that perfect stillness, he admitted to himself that he was at a loss. The moment of disappearance had no witness, it had no sound, no struggle, no aftermath. The case notes summed it up with one line that frustrated him for the rest of his career: last seen painting her room, last action in progress, point of departure unknown. It was the unknown that gnawed at everyone, that, and the brush lying on the floor, forever angled toward the unfinished wall, as though waiting for the hand that would never pick it up again. The morning after Ellie's disappearance, the Carver house no longer felt like a home. It felt like an exhibit. Yellow tape framed the walkway, a county police van idled at the curb. Detectives in plain shirts and loosened ties moved in and out of the front door, carrying notebooks and plastic evidence bags. Inside, every sound was amplified: the scuff of shoes on the hardwood, the low murmur of questions, the muted click of a camera shutter capturing the brush, the paint tray, the unfinished wall. Detective Paul Hensley started with the family. His approach was careful, slow, as if afraid that pushing too hard would shatter the fragile timeline. They had Margaret's account. Shed left for the grocery store at 11:20 a.m. After checking in on Ellie at the time, Ellie was painting the lower trim along the wall opposite the window. She'd been humming. Margaret thought it was a Fleetwood Mac song and seemed entirely focused. Nothing about her manner suggested urgency or distress. Richard's account he had last seen Ellie at breakfast around 8:00 a.m. She'd been in good spirits, talking about how the light from the east window made her paint look like it was glowing. He left for work shortly after. Daniel's account, his sister had told him she might ride bikes later, but she didn't sound committed. She looked happy. He said, just busy. All three insisted Ellie had no reason to leave abruptly, no history of running away, and no ongoing conflict that would have pushed her to vanish. Hensley moved next to the neighbor's Mrs. Heller saw Ellie at the window around 1:05 p.m. holding a paintbrush, hair falling over her shoulder, said she looked directly at her, lips moving as though speaking. Mrs. Heller thought she mouthed the word wait, but wasn't sure. She blinked, and Ellie stepped back from the window. Mr. and Mrs. Benson heard nothing unusual. Their teenage son Gary claimed he didn't see her at all that day. Mr. Arnold, 2 houses down, around 2:05 p.m. heard a faint dragging noise like a chair across a floor coming from the Carver house. Didn't think much of it the first sweep. The official search that day turned up no trace of Ellie. The police combed through every inch of the home again, closets, attic, crawl space, and extended the search to neighbors' properties. They checked under porches, sheds, and garages. By the second day, they had volunteers walking the wooded trails near the river bend. Boats were sent along the shallows to check for anything caught along the banks. Nothing. The absence of evidence became its own kind of presence. Emerging theories within the first 72 hours. 2 primary theories emerged. Voluntary departure. Ellie walked out of the house willingly, perhaps to meet someone. Evidence for no signs of struggle. Open window could suggest she left without being seen. Problems: no shoes, no purse, no note, no change of clothes. Missing paintbrush, left mid-task. No one saw her outside. Abduction: someone entered the home while she was painting and took her. Evidence for sudden disappearance. Neighbors' account of dragging noise. Problems: no forced entry, no physical evidence, no fingerprints, fibers, shoe prints. How would someone remove her without being seen in daylight? Contradictions. It didn't take long for the investigation to start collecting tiny cracks in the timeline. The dragging sound: Mr. Arnold was certain he heard it at 2:05 p.m., but Margaret's grocery receipt showed she returned by 3:10 p.m., meaning if someone was moving furniture to stage a cover-up, they had barely an hour, yet nothing in the room had been moved or disturbed. The dogs on the second day search: dogs were brought inside. They followed Ellie's scent from her bed to the doorway of her room, and then stopped. They would not step onto the sheets spread over the carpet. Some pulled back entirely. Whining handlers reported no obvious scent contamination. The official report described it as abnormal reluctance. The radio: Margaret swore the radio had been playing when she left. When she returned, it was switched off, not unplugged, just turned off at the knob. Fingerprint dusting revealed only Ellie's prints and Margaret's from dusting the dresser weeks earlier. The friends' accounts. By day 4, police began interviewing Ellie's friends more deeply. Laura Miller, best friend, claimed Ellie had seemed quiet but not sad the week before. Ellie told her she'd been thinking about things differently lately, but wouldn't say what. Laura admitted Ellie had become fascinated with a local urban legend about a woman who disappeared from her own kitchen in 1949, leaving a cake in the oven. Ben Carter, classmate, said Ellie had asked him if he ever felt like time didn't always move the way it should. When pressed, he shrugged and called it an artsy thing. The lead that went nowhere. On the 5th day, a report came in from a convenience store clerk 20 miles away. She believed she'd seen a girl matching Ellie's description come in barefoot, buy a bottle of water, and leave with a man in a pale blue car. Security footage was requested, but by the time police retrieved it, the tape had been overwritten. The store reused them every 3 days. Without it, the lead collapsed. The emotional undertow. By the end of the first week, the Carver home had become quieter than quiet. The police presence thinned. Reporters moved on to other stories, but the room, that half-painted room, remained exactly as it had been on August 14th. The brush stayed on the floor. The paint tray stayed under the window. Margaret refused to move anything. Richard kept the door shut, but not locked. Daniel stopped sleeping in his own bed, moving instead to the couch downstairs. Detective Hensley returned often in the first month, standing in the doorway, sometimes stepping inside, sometimes not. He later told a journalist, "Every time I looked at that wall, I felt like the answer was there, but not in any way I could prove." The case stalls. After 2 months, the official search slowed to periodic check-ins. Tips still came in, but each one led to another dead end. Ellie's name joined the National Missing Persons Registry. Her photograph, smiling hair, pulled back eyes, bright, appeared on flyers and local shop windows, and eventually in a small corner of the Illinois missing poster that hung at the post office. The file remained open, but there was nothing new to put in it, and so the investigation, like the brush on the floor, seemed suspended in midair. From the front porch of the Carver home, if you look across the street, you see a house that seems to absorb the light around it. The Bensons had lived there since the mid-70s. Harold, a quiet man who worked nights as a long-haul trucker. Marlene, a nurse with a tired voice and tired eyes. and their son Gary, 19, known mostly for keeping to himself. The Benson house was a place of still curtains and locked gates. You could pass it at noon in July and still find the windows closed, the blinds drawn, the air inside unmoving. In the days after Ellie's disappearance, Detective Hensley and his team canvassed the neighborhood again, asking the same questions in different ways, looking for cracks in people's stories. When they spoke to Marlene, she seemed reluctant, folding her arms tight across her chest. She said she'd been on shift at the county hospital that day. Harold was on the road, and Gary had been home. As far as I know, she insisted they'd seen and heard nothing unusual. Gary's version was different, or at least emptier. He told police he hadn't looked out the window once that day, hadn't seen Ellie at all, and didn't know what they were talking about when they asked about the window directly facing hers. But hey, race the thing. Two neighbors, unprompted, said they'd noticed Gary sitting on his porch in the early afternoon, staring toward the Carver house, not in conversation, not reading, just watching the paint on his shirt. 3 weeks after Ellie disappeared, Laura Miller, Ellie's best friend, told police something she hadn't mentioned before. She'd seen Gary at the corner store 2 days after the disappearance, wearing a faded white t-shirt with what looked like gray paint streaks along the hem. She didn't think much of it at the time. People painted houses all the time in summer, but after the news it stuck with her. When questioned, Gary admitted he'd been painting an old bookshelf in the garage that week, but the color's sort of grayish. He said can't remember the name. Detectives quietly collected a scrap of that bookshelf from the Bensons' garage. The paint was indeed gray, but a warmer brown-tinted gray, nothing like the silver tone of morning fog. Still, the coincidence was enough to keep Gary in the margins of the case. File the lights in the night. It wasn't just the paint. About a month after Ellie's disappearance, Richard Carver was sitting up late in the living room, unable to sleep. Through the blinds, he saw a flicker across the street, a stuttering, irregular light from an upstairs Benson window. It pulsed for about 20 seconds, then went dark. The next night it happened again, around the same time, a jagged burst of light that stopped abruptly, as if a lamp had been yanked from the wall. When he mentioned it to Hensley, the detective made a note, but didn't have enough to act on. Gary, when asked, claimed he was messing with an old slide projector. The glimpses, there were other smaller moments. Mrs. Heller said she sometimes caught Gary in the upstairs window, standing completely still, just looking. Not always toward the Carvers, sometimes toward the streetlight, sometimes toward nothing at all. Kids on bikes said he had a way of appearing at the side gate. Without making a sound, they'd be pedaling past, and suddenly there he was, leaning against the fence, not saying a word. None of it was illegal, none of it proved anything, but it fed a quiet current of suspicion. The police visit 2 months into the investigation. Hensley got a warrant to search the Benson property, citing inconsistencies in Gary's statements and multiple witness reports of him near the Carver home. The search turned up nothing directly tied to Ellie. No clothing, no personal items, no trace of morning fog paint. But in the garage, they found an old Polaroid camera and a shoebox of photographs, most of them landscapes, a few candid shots of neighborhood yards. A handful of them were of the Carver house, taken from the Bensons' front lawn. In one, the upstairs window of Ellie's room was visible, curtain drawn back. When asked about the photos, Gary shrugged and said he liked the way the light fell on the houses in the morning. He claimed the shots of the Carver home were taken the year before, without proof otherwise. The photos went back in the box back. To Gary, the lingering unease, the search might have cleared the Bensons in the eyes of the law, but not in the minds of everyone else. Richard began drawing the living room curtains earlier in the day. Margaret stopped answering the door, unless she knew exactly who was on the other side. Daniel, already restless, started avoiding the street entirely, walking around the block rather than passing the Benson house. When the street went quiet at night, you could almost feel the space between the two houses, a taut, invisible line drawn across the asphalt. Detective Hensley didn't officially pursue the Bensons any further, but he admitted later in an off-the-record conversation, "I never ruled them out completely, but sometimes you can feel in your gut when you're chasing the wrong shadow, and in this case, I wasn't sure which shadow was the right one." Time moved on, at least everywhere except inside that room. By the late 1990s, Ellie's case had slipped into the category detectives dread, most inactive. No new leads. Her file sat in the archives in a gray cabinet, the edges of its manila folder softening with age. Hensley had retired. Daniel was grown and living in another state. Richard's hair had gone white, and still the Carvers left the room untouched. The door remained closed most of the year, opened only on the anniversary of her disappearance. Margaret claimed she did it to let the air change, but in truth, she said the air never seemed to change at all. It was around this time that a journalist named Thomas Keene took an interest in the case. Keene wrote for Midwestern Mysteries, a small but devoted quarterly magazine that specialized in cold cases, folklore, and the stranger corners of small-town history. He had been 11 years old when Ellie vanished, living only 3 towns over, and remembered seeing her photograph on flyers. Something about the image had stayed with him, the half-smile, the tilt of her head, as if she was just about to say something when the camera caught her. When Keene contacted the Carvers in 1999, Margaret hesitated. They'd had their share of outsiders promising fresh eyes, only to leave with little more than a quote or two. But something in Keene's quiet persistence convinced her. She agreed to let him visit. First entry: the day he stepped inside, Keene carried a notebook, a small recorder, and a Nikon camera slung over his shoulder. Margaret led him down the hall and opened the door. The moment it swung wide, the temperature dropped, not dramatically, but noticeably enough that Keene paused. "Is the vent closed in here?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. The house had one central air system. No room should have felt different from another. His first impression was that nothing looked 37 years old. The morning fog was still as soft and luminous as the day it was. Applied, no cracks, no peeling, no sun fade from the window. He knelt by the paintbrush. The bristles had hardened long ago, but the curve of the final stroke on the wall, the one that trailed off into nothing, caught his attention. In certain light it shone as if the paint were still wet. Keene reached out, but stopped short of touching it. He couldn't say why, only that it felt wrong to Margaret's story. In the interview, Margaret told him things she had never told reporters. The smell of fresh paint had never left the room. On the anniversary each year, she sometimes thought she heard footsteps upstairs before she opened the door, slow, even steps, like someone pacing. Once, 5 years after Ellie vanished, she had left the window cracked on a summer night. In the morning, the brush had shifted slightly, not fallen, just angled a little differently toward the wall. She never told Richard. When Keene asked if she believed in anything supernatural, she smiled sadly. "I believe in my daughter," she said, "and I believe she's not here beyond that. I'm open to whatever keeps me from going mad." The photographs: Keene spent the afternoon photographing the room from every angle. Later, when he developed the film, he noticed something strange. In 3 frames, the curve of the final brushstroke looked subtly different. In one, it seemed a millimeter longer. In another, the sheen had dulled. He thought it might be the angle of light, but when he overlaid the images, the changes didn't quite align. He never published those photos in the article. He said it felt too speculative, and he didn't want the case reduced to a ghost story. But privately, he admitted they unsettled him. The chill in the air while Keene stood at the window, jotting notes. Margaret left to answer the phone. He was alone in the room for less than 2 minutes. That's when he felt it, the faintest movement of air, not a breeze, but something like an exhale, warm and cool at the same time, passing behind his neck. He turned sharply. The door was still open. The hallway beyond was empty. The paintbrush lay exactly where it had been. The wall was unchanged, but his recorder, which had been on the windowsill, had stopped. The tape inside had run blank for exactly 23 seconds. The article, when Midwestern Mysteries published Keene's piece later that year, it walked the line between fact and atmosphere. He detailed the timeline, the neighbor sightings, the inexplicable lack of evidence. But he also described the room in a way that made readers feel they'd stepped inside it themselves. It is a room caught between heartbeats, a place where the air feels heavier than it should, and the colors don't age. Whether you believe in such things or not, you leave with the sense that something in that room is unfinished and waiting. The article brought a brief resurgence of interest in the case. Old tips were re-examined, a few new ones came in, none leading anywhere, and then the house went quiet again. Every unsolved disappearance leaves behind a fracture, a crack in the timeline, where events should flow in a straight, sensible line, but instead stop. Ellie's crack wasn't just a gap in time, it was an absence, so clean it felt deliberate. Over the years, 4 main theories emerged. None ever closed the case. All were compelling in their own way. Theory 1: the voluntary exit. Some believed Ellie had simply walked away from her life, a quiet rebellion, and escape from small-town gravity before it pinned her forever. In this version, she set down the brush, climbed out the window, and slipped into a waiting car, maybe the pale blue Ford reported by the convenience store clerk 2 days later. The appeal of this theory lies in its simplicity: no crime, no abduction, just a girl choosing her own path. But the cracks appear quickly. She left barefoot, without money, without even turning off the radio, and no one, not a single person, ever reported seeing her again in any city under any name. If she left willingly, she Left as a ghost theory to the abduction, the second and most commonly whispered is the abduction theory that someone, maybe a stranger, maybe someone she knew, entered the house between 105 and 2:20 p.m. and took her. The dragging noise reported by Mr. Arnold fits neatly here. A struggle, a body, moved furniture, shifted to block something. But there's a problem. The room was pristine, no overturned chair, no broken items, no stray fibers or fingerprints that didn't belong to the family, even the sheet under the paint can was undisturbed, as though no one had stepped beyond its edges. Hensley once said, "If it was an abduction, it was the cleanest I've ever seen, and clean crimes don't happen in broad daylight without planning." A lot of planning. Theory 3: the time slip. This one didn't come from the police, it came from the town itself, whispered in kitchens and church basements. The time slip theory says Ellie didn't leave at all. She shifted, stepped from one moment into another, like slipping through a tear in a curtain. Proponents point to the strange stillness of the room, the untouched quality of the paint, the dogs that refuse to cross the threshold. They argue she might still be there in some version of the room, layered on top of ours, forever frozen mid-stroke. It's easy to dismiss as superstition until you hear Mrs. Heller's account again. The way Ellie's lips moved in the window, the single word she thought might have been wait, for what or for when. Theory 4: the disappearance in place A. Darker cousin of the time slip idea. This one suggests Ellie never left the room, but whatever happened to her altered her in a way that made her unfindable, not gone exactly, but beyond our ability to detect. Keene, the journalist, once likened it to a photo where someone's been cut out so cleanly you'd swear they were never in it, except the shadows still look wrong. This theory feeds on the room's persistence. The paint never fades, the air never changes, the final stroke always looks unfinished. The shadow possibilities outside those, for there are stranger footnotes. A retired postal worker claimed he saw Ellie years later in Indiana standing in line at a bus station, wearing a coat 2 sizes too big. He swears she looked straight at him, but didn't seem to recognize his face. A hunter said he found a scrap of fabric deep in the woods in 1990 for the same pale cotton as the shirt she wore that day. It was damp, even though the ground was dry. He lost it before police could test it. And then there was the rumor that the Bensons, the reclusive neighbors, kept a locked storage unit outside town, though no proof ever surfaced. Each lead flickered, then went out. The emotional divide. Theories aren't just about facts, they're about need. Margaret leans toward the time slip idea, though she wouldn't use those words. She says she believes Ellie is somewhere safe, just not here. Richard believes in the abduction theory. He wants someone to blame, someone whose face he can hate. Daniel refuses to choose, he says. Choosing means deciding she's not coming back. The comment threads. In recent years, the case has gained a small afterlife. Online true crime forums dissect the photos of the room, arguing about the brush angle, the light from the window, the color of the paint. Reddit threads spill hundreds of comments debating whether the dragging noise could have been unrelated, a neighbor moving furniture, or the exact moment Ellie ceased to be part of the world we can touch. A post from one user in 2021 still lingers in the back corners of the internet. Look at the police photo closely, see the curve of the last stroke. That shape shows up in her art too. She drew that curve over and over. It's almost like she was painting something shed already seen. No theory fits perfectly. Everyone collapses somewhere under its own weight, but in the end they all circle the same unanswerable truth. On a summer afternoon in 1982, a girl was painting her room. She set down her brush mid-stroke, and in the time it took for the paint to dry, she was gone. It was 31 years after Ellie vanished when the phone rang in the Carver home with a voice from the past. Margaret almost didn't answer. She rarely did anymore, unless the number was familiar, but something about the pause before the first ring ended made her lift the receiver. The man on the other end introduced himself as David Lanning. He sounded older, the slow, measured cadence of someone who'd been carrying a heavy thought for too long. "I think," he said quietly, "I saw your daughter the day she disappeared." The memory that wouldn't leave. David had been 20 at the time, working part-time as a delivery driver for a hardware store on the edge of town. His route took him past the Carver Street around midday. It had been an unremarkable day, he said, warm, bright, the kind of heat that softens the air. He remembered because his truck's AC was broken, and the breeze through the open window was the only relief as he drove past the Carver house. Something caught his attention, a girl stepping off the curb 2 houses down, barefoot, wearing jeans and a pale cotton shirt. She was carrying nothing, no bag, no shoes, no water bottle. She walked quickly, but not in a panic, glancing over her shoulder once toward the street behind her, then from a side street, a pale blue Ford sedan rolled into view. It slowed. As it approached her, she didn't wave it down, David said. It just stopped right next to her. The driver leaned over, a man, maybe mid-30s with dark hair. The girl spoke to him through the open window. For maybe 10 seconds, then, without hesitation, she opened the passenger door and got in the car, drove away in the opposite direction of downtown. Why he stayed silent. When police canvassed the neighborhood that week, David was out of town visiting family. By the time he heard about Ellie's disappearance, he says the details had blurred in his mind. I wasn't even sure it was her, he admitted, and I didn't want to waste the cops' time on something I couldn't swear to. But over the years, the image of her hair, pulled back, sunlight catching her face, kept returning in dreams. When he saw a recent online article about the case, the memory snapped into clarity. She looked calm, he said, like she knew the man. That's what stuck with me. She didn't hesitate. The Ford lead detective Hensley had long since retired, but when the statement reached him through unofficial channels, he agreed to review it. The pale blue Ford had been mentioned once before. The convenience store clerk's account of a barefoot girl with a man. 2 days after the disappearance, 2 sightings, possibly the same car, but 31 years apart from the day it could have been traced. There was nothing to follow. DMV records had been purged. The description, pale blue Ford, was too common, too vague. The discrepancy. David's account raised a question that cut the case open again. If Ellie left her room voluntarily to meet someone, why in the middle of painting? Why barefoot? Why leave everything behind? The idea that she knew the driver was both comforting and chilling. Comforting because it suggested she hadn't been forcibly taken in broad daylight. Chilling because it meant the danger may have come from someone inside her own world. Margaret found herself replaying the days before Ellie disappeared. Had her daughter mentioned a name she didn't recognize? Had there been phone calls she hadn't overheard? She couldn't remember, and now the not remembering felt like guilt. The test of memory. Cold case specialists caution against trusting decades-old eyewitness accounts. Memory is elastic. It folds and reshapes to fit the narratives we tell ourselves. Still, there was a detail in David's account that matched something buried in the original file. The jeans. Police had recorded that Ellie's jeans had flecks of paint on them. When Margaret saw her that morning, David, unprompted, described a smudge of gray on her left knee. That smudge had never been in the newspapers. Theories rewritten. The forgotten witness shifted the weight of the theories again. If true, the voluntary departure theory gained new ground. She left the room and got into the car by choice, but this didn't explain the abruptness, the brush mid-stroke, the untouched room. The abduction theory gained a new angle. The driver was known to her enough to disarm her. Even the stranger theories, the time slip, the disappearance in place, bent under the pressure of this new possibility. Some argued that the man in the Ford could have been the first person to encounter her after something inexplicable happened, someone who found her disoriented and barefoot. Margaret's response when asked if she believed David's account. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, I believe he believes it, and if it was her, I hope she wasn't afraid. But that night, she didn't open Ellie's door like she usually did on the anniversary. She left it closed, as if to protect it from a truth she wasn't ready to let in. The last time he saw her, David ended his statement with a sentence that never left Margaret's mind. When the car turned the corner, she looked out the window right at me. She didn't wave, but it felt like she wanted to. You can measure the years in the Carver house by the things that changed. The carpet in the living room replaced after a flood, the yellowing of photographs on the hallway wall, the way the wood on the banister has been polished smooth by decades of hands. But in Ellie's room, nothing changes. The paintbrush still lies on the floor where she left it, bristles down, angled toward the wall, like a compass pointing to an answer no one can read. The wooden handle is still faintly warm in tone, untouched by mold or damp. The silvery gray bristles are stiff, fused together by a pigment that under certain light gleams like it was applied minutes ago. And the final stroke, the one that curves downward and stops short, still holds the faint sheen of wet paint. The forensic explanation. In the early 2000s, a forensic materials analyst named Dr. Catherine Moore came to examine the room at the request of a cold case unit. She specialized in paint chemistry, and her goal was simple: explain why a 20-year-old stroke still looked fresh. Her conclusion was straightforward and unsatisfying. The paint's formula from the early 80s contained higher oil content than modern blends, combined with the room's low light exposure and a layer of airborne particulates. The top layer of pigment had formed a thin reflective skin that mimicked the look of fresh paint, a trick of chemistry. She called it a trick that just happened to exist in the exact spot Ellie vanished. The local explanation outside of labs. The explanation was Different to the locals who still remembered that August day, the sheen wasn't chemistry, it was memory. They said the stroke stayed wet because it hadn't been finished, and things left unfinished in some way refused to move forward. One man compared it to bread dough that never rises no matter how much yeast you add. Another to a clock that stops in the middle of a chime, and there were those who whispered that the stroke was holding her, that whatever happened, whatever took her, was caught there like a reflection in a drop of water waiting to be let out. The photographer's detail. In 2014, a local photographer named Amy Leland visited the room for an art series on places that wait. She took high-resolution close-ups of the brushstroke, planning to print them in black and white. When she reviewed the shots later, she noticed something odd. In 3 images taken seconds apart, the reflections on the paint's surface were different, not just the angle of light, but the shape. In one, it looked like a crescent. In another, a vertical slash. In the third, a faint oval. When she overlaid the shapes, they formed a curve almost identical to the brush's arc. Almost. She deleted the files. She couldn't explain why, only that the longer I looked at them, the more I felt like I was intruding on something that didn't want to be seen. The last witness. By now, the brush has outlived nearly everyone who first saw it. Patrolman wrote Detective Hensley. Even some of the neighbors. It has become the one constant, the silent witness that never changed its story. In the absence of any other evidence, it is treated with a strange reverence, neither moved nor cleaned, dust allowed to gather everywhere except the bristles themselves. Daniel once admitted, "It's the only part of her I believe might actually still be here." The anniversary ritual. Every August 14th, Margaret still opens the door to the room. She doesn't step inside. She just stands in the doorway. The air smells faintly of morning fog, like the first day she bought the can. She looks at the brush, the wall, the stroke, and whispers something only she can hear. She has never told anyone what she says, the thing no one wants to touch in all the decades since no one has dared lift the brush. Not family, not police, not journalists. It isn't out of superstition, exactly. It's more a quiet agreement that the brush belongs to whatever moment it was part of, and removing it might sever the last invisible thread leading back to her. Whether that thread leads forward into the present or backward into the moment she disappeared, no one can say. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it just teaches you how to live around them. For the Carver's life after Ellie's disappearance became a series of practiced adjustments, a rearranging of habits so the absence didn't sting as sharply in daylight, and then learning to survive the nights when it did. Margaret, in the first years, Margaret kept Ellie's room open. She would step inside every morning, run her fingers along the window frame, smooth the bedsheet on the carpet as though preparing for her daughter to pick up the brush and finish what she started. She baked bread on Sundays, just as she had before, but the loaves grew smaller. She stopped making the lemon cookies Ellie liked because no one else in the house would eat them. When well-meaning neighbors told her to move on or let her rest, she smiled politely and then locked the bathroom door so she could cry without anyone knocking. By the late 1990s, she had stopped entering the room at all except on August 14th. The rest of the year it was sealed like a wound under a bandage. Richard grieved differently, more quietly, but no less deeply. He became a man of fewer words, as if speaking might tempt him to say the wrong thing and make the grief heavier. For the first 5 years, he drove different routes to and from the garage, where he worked, scanning faces on sidewalks, glancing into the passenger seats of passing cars. Even after he stopped actively looking, his eyes still flicked toward pale blue sedans without him realizing it. On the rare nights he drank, he'd sit at the kitchen table and turn over the same sentence like a stone. "Someone knows something." Daniel, for Daniel, who had been only 11 when she disappeared, the silence wasn't just grief, it was identity. He grew up with the sister who vanished as his defining shadow. Teachers, new classmates whispered in college. When people asked if he had siblings, he always hesitated before answering. When he visited home, he avoided the hallway where her door waited. Even decades later, when he had children of his own, he never let them into the room. "It's not for them," he told his wife once, and wouldn't elaborate. The house that learned to live with it. The Carver house adapted in subtle ways. The radio in the kitchen was always turned off unless someone was actively listening, an unspoken echo of the day Margaret came home to find Ellie's radio silent. The upstairs hallway was repainted in soft beige in 1991, but the trim stopped abruptly at the edge of her doorframe, as if crossing that threshold with a brush would be a kind of betrayal. Every August 14th, the house slowed. Breakfasts were eaten in silence. Phone calls went unanswered. The day was not marked on the calendar. But everyone knew the things they never said. There were conversations that never happened. Margaret never asked Richard if he thought they'd find her alive. Richard never told Margaret about the time he thought he saw her in the crowd at a county fair, only for the girl to turn and reveal she was a stranger. Daniel never admitted that sometimes when he visited he thought he heard faint humming from upstairs, and that it scared him more than it comforted him. The unbearable thought, more than the mystery, more than the theories. It was the not knowing that gnawed at them. Not knowing meant Ellie could still be alive. Not knowing meant she could have suffered. Not knowing meant every new clue was both a hope and a threat. Margaret once said to Keene, the journalist, "If you told me she died that day, I could mourn her. If you told me she was alive somewhere, I could try to find her. But you tell me nothing, and am stuck in both at once." The still room. They didn't call it Ellie's room anymore. They called it the room, or quietly the still room. Even Daniel's kids picked up the habit without being told. It became the house's own private superstition. The Carvers didn't keep plants in it. Nothing living seemed to last there. They didn't store anything in it either, as if placing a box inside would disturb the balance. And still the paintbrush waited. The door opens with the same small sigh it has given for 43 years. The air inside is cool, not in the way of climate control, but in the way of old church stone, a quiet, unmoving chill that feels untouched by weather. Light from the east window falls across the floor in slow-moving rectangles, stretching toward the far wall. The half-painted wall looks exactly as it did the day she left it. The upper half glows in morning fog, the lower half still the dull beige of its former life. The dividing line is soft, uneven, the brushstroke curving downward in a motion that should have ended, but didn't. The brush lies exactly where it has always been, angled toward the unfinished arc. The paint tray, hardened into ripples, sits beside it like a frozen pond. It is not the kind of scene that shouts for attention. It whispers, and the longer you look, the harder it is to tell what it's saying. The quiet that isn't empty. You stand there long enough, and the silence changes. It stops being the absence of sound and becomes something heavier. Some visitors have described it as the feeling of being watched, though there's nowhere in the room for anyone to hide. Others say it feels like the air is holding its breath, waiting for you to do something you don't yet know you're supposed to do. It's not a threatening feeling, but it isn't comforting either. What the room knows, there's a strange conviction you get here that the room remembers, that it knows exactly what happened that day in 1982 and is keeping it the way you might keep a secret you've promised never to tell. The brush, the wall, the last stroke, they aren't relics, they're witnesses, and they are still in the act of witnessing. You find yourself thinking that if you were here at the right moment, in the right light, you might see it, the hand moving, the bristles pressing into the wall, the exact second where time stopped, the weight of an unfinished thing. Unfinished things have a gravity to them. They pull at you, asking to be resolved. But in this room, the unfinished has become the point. The incomplete stroke isn't waiting for completion. It's what's holding everything else in place. If the stroke were ever finished, maybe the room would breathe again, or maybe it would exhale something you can't take back. Margaret's last visit in recent years. Margaret has grown frilier, but she still opens the door on August 14th. She stands in the threshold, fingers resting lightly on the frame. She doesn't speak now, or if she does, it's too soft to hear. She stays for less than a minute, then closes the door again, not quickly, just enough to make you feel the room sigh once more. Daniel has promised to keep the tradition. When she's gone, it's not about remembering her, he told someone once. It's about keeping the place she left open in case she finds her way back. The room waits, and so it waits, through winters that ice the windows and summers that bake the roof, through the shifting of the neighborhood around it, new families moving in, old ones moving away, through decades of theories and sightings and photographs that never quite prove anything. The wall stays half-painted, the brush stays angled, the stroke stays wet, and in the air, in the silence, there's a sense that the moment hasn't ended, that somewhere in some way the girl is still here, mid-motion, mid-breath, mid-summer, and the room is holding her place.